Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. So supposedly Russia is massing for a new offensive on the east and south of Ukraine. I wanted to check back in with Marcus Kolga, who is a expert on what's going on Eastern Europe, Ukraine, Russia. He works with the Macdonald Laurier Institute. He's unbelievably knowledgeable. He's a disinformation expert. He's a filmmaker, and he's a really smart guy. Marcus, welcome to the show. How are you, sir?
I'm doing well, keeping on what's happening in Ukraine, and that's always exhausting because things are changing every single hour and day. So keeping on what's going on and trying to keep track of it.
I see on social media that you've been at a bunch of rallies for Ukraine as well.
Yeah, well, I feel like we need to show our support for Ukrainian Canadians here in Canada. They've been sitting on the edges of their seat, watching what's happening to their friends and family in Ukraine for the past 7 weeks. And so anything that I can do to help voice my support for them and rally other Central and Eastern European communities to support them, that's more than happy to do that.
So we had, I think, the first show prior to the invasion when there were just rumors and the United States intelligence community was saying that Putin was massing 100,000 troops, and lots of people never believed it would happen. And you were one of the people that said it probably will, and you were right. And you have warned us correctly a lot of times over the course of the last month and a half. Tell me, where are we now, and what's your prognosis?
Well, look, I think the war has, this expanded war that none of us actually predicted, has turned out to be quite the disaster for Vladimir Putin. He has failed to take key objectives, that includes Kiev, and has reverted to taking out his frustration on the people of Ukraine, engaging in mass atrocities, some are calling it genocide. And now he is resetting his strategy, if one could even call it that, because I fail to see the strategy in any of what he's doing right now. But he is resetting clearly and refocusing his objectives on Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine. This is what you and I talked about before the war. We talked about what his possible objectives could be, and he's gone back to targeting Eastern Ukraine and Southern Ukraine right now. He has, because of the failures that he's experienced, he's appointed a new general who is going to be in command of all of the forces that are currently invading Ukraine. His name is General Dvornikov. He is also known as the Butcher of Aleppo because of the mass terror he was behind in the war in Syria. It is widely suspected that he is going to engage in the same sort of tactics, what the Russians are calling the depopulation of urban centers in eastern Ukraine and southern Ukraine. So, the increasing terror that we've seen over the past 2 weeks, whether it's the massacre in Bucha, the rocket attack on the train station this past Friday, I think that we're going to see an intensification of those sorts of tactics. And I think Western governments, unless they are ready to step in and help protect the refugees and citizens of Ukraine, I think we're only going to see an ever-increasing body count among the civilian population in Ukraine.
Marcus, I just don't understand this. I thought that Putin's justification was he was going to go in and protect Russian-speaking Ukrainians in eastern and southeastern Ukraine. And I've spoken over the weekend with someone from Kharkiv. She said that 90% of the people in Kharkiv spoke Russian. I spoke with someone from Odessa who said 95% of the people in Odessa spoke Russian, but none of them are speaking Russian anymore. They're all going and starting to speak Ukrainian because they can't stand Russia and Russians, and they're finding even more so their Ukrainian heritage and loyalty. Wow. And we're hearing like 10,000 people have been killed in Mariupol, and the communities that these two people that I've interviewed, thankfully they're still alive, but the suburbs of those cities have been devastated. How does this all make sense?
Well, you're absolutely right. I mean, I mentioned before, I mean, I fail, and I think a lot of experts fail to see the strategy in this. If Vladimir Putin was hoping to win over the hearts and minds of Russian-speaking Ukrainians, he's achieving quite the opposite. He is promoting and instilling the sense of hate towards the Putin regime. You could even say, Russians more broadly, in fact. And so it's hard to see what the strategy is here. Again, that devastation, you mentioned 10,000 dead in Mariupol. Thousands have apparently been deported forcibly to Russia. The images that we're seeing from cities like Kharkiv, from Mariupol, where the entire city is being basically decimated. It's being turned into rubble. By some estimates, 90% of or if not more, of the civilian infrastructure has been damaged or destroyed. These Russian rockets have been targeting hospitals, schools, kindergartens. And of course, as we saw just last Friday in Kramatorsk, we saw this rocket attack against a train station that was filled with refugees fleeing the war in eastern Ukraine. And let's not forget, when we talk about refugees in this war, we're talking about primarily women, children, the elderly. There were no soldiers among those people. These were refugees who had found some relief in arriving at a train station, knowing that they would be able to board a train and flee westward to safety, that their children would be safe. The rockets rained down on them. And on Saturday afternoon and through the weekend, Ukrainian authorities were cleaning up body parts that were all over the square at the train station. The terror, the horror is just unspeakable in Ukraine right now. And we keep seeing these scenes over and over again. My fear is that, as I mentioned earlier, that if the West doesn't step in to provide and defend these humanitarian corridors that will allow the refugees to safely flee these areas, the carnage will only continue. Russia clearly has no issue with targeting innocent civilians. And as I mentioned earlier as well, they brought in a general who specializes in killing civilians. And so, like I said, the carnage will only continue unless we step in to stop it.
We're chatting today with Marcus Kolga, an expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe and the Russian invasion into Ukraine. We're going to take a quick 2-minute break for some messages and be back with Marcus in 2 minutes. Stay with us, everybody. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. We're chatting tonight with Marcus Kolga, who is an expert on Eastern Europe, an expert on what's going on between Russia and Ukraine. He is with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He is a filmmaker. He is an expert on disinformation, which we might come back to later on and chat about, because I think there's been a lot of disinformation in this invasion. But let me turn, Marcus, if I could, to what you think the West should do, because your last comment was if the West does not do something to protect the humanitarian refugee corridors, that there's going to be carnage. So what can we do?
Look, I think if we're talking about Canada, we need to supply more lethal defensive weapons. Our other NATO allies are pitching in and doing so quite generously. A country like Estonia, this is one of our Eastern NATO allies. My parents happen to be from Estonia. They've so far contributed $250 million worth of lethal defensive weapons to Ukraine. This is a country that has a population that's about the size of Calgary. When you compare it to Canada's 40 million, we need to be doing a little bit more. What we've sent some anti-tank weapons, but mostly we've sent some aging grenades, some old rifles, some defensive weapons, defensive equipment, flak jackets, some helmets and such. We need to do a heck of a lot more. We need to send weapons that will help the Ukrainians stop the tanks that are now rolling into Eastern Ukraine. We've seen pictures of of convoys that are several kilometers long that are preparing. They're pouring into eastern Ukraine and preparing to attack. We need to make sure that the Ukrainians have surface-to-air missiles to stop the aircraft, especially high-level aircraft. Earlier they were bombing quite low. Now they've moved to a very high level, and that's why we're seeing a lot of the indiscriminate bombing, because these are dumb bombs. Russia doesn't have the technology that the West has, so they're just dropping bombs en masse onto urban centers. So we need to provide them the sort of technology that allows them to defend against these sorts of strikes. Another piece of equipment that Canada has and that Ukraine could absolutely use are what are called Harpoon missiles. These are surface-to-sea missiles that can help take out some of the Russian naval units that are shooting cruise missiles and various other forms of weapons at cities like Mariupol. One of the centers that we definitely need to defend is Odessa. Odessa is of course, the southwest of the country on the Black Sea. This is a critically important port that's used to transport grain out of Ukraine. And I think a lot of your listeners will have heard on the news that there is a growing threat of global the threat of a destabilizing global food networks because of this war, that grain will not arrive in places like the Caucasus, Central Asia, Africa. The Russians have clearly started targeting Odessa from the sea. And so these Harpoon missiles could prevent this international food crisis, this global food crisis that could occur if Russia destroys the infrastructure that would allow Ukraine to transport that grain abroad. So those are a few ways that we can help arm the Ukrainians. And certainly if we don't have the weapons ourselves, we've been told that our cupboards are essentially bare because we've failed to maintain and fully arm our own army. Maybe we should be working with our allies, countries like Slovakia, who have now provided surface-to-air missiles, Poland, who's offered several times to send jets to Ukraine, the Baltics, as I mentioned earlier, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, all of them have weapons that they can help provide to the Ukrainians. And what Canada could be doing is backfilling anything that is sent. You know, if we send, say, one of our Baltic allies sends a few drones to Ukraine, we could pay for those drones to be replaced, and we would be making an important contribution in that way. But so far, as I mentioned, we haven't done that. We've only sent $40 million in lethal aid, whereas our smaller Eastern allies have sent much, much more. So there's still a lot we can do to help the Ukrainians defend themselves from these barbaric attacks on their civilians.
What about NATO? What should NATO be doing?
Well, NATO, first of all, the UN should really be protecting these refugees. That's the UN's role. And, quite frankly, the UN, other than kicking Russia out of the UN Human Rights Council, which is an ineffective body in and of itself, the UN has done very little when it comes to helping protect the civilians and refugees. Canada should be pushing more within the UN, although I have to say that our ambassador there, Bob Ray, has been doing an incredible job of speaking up for Ukraine. The UN needs to be stepping up. Barring that, NATO should be stepping up.
Let's stop just for a second. I apologize. So how does the UN step up when Russia has a veto on the Security Council?
Well, and this is a problem, is that even if you had something come to the floor of the General Assembly, a resolution to protect or send peacekeepers to Ukraine, it's extremely likely that Russia would veto that. Russia is not interested in having UN peacekeepers keep the peace during its own invasion. So you're right. That resolution would ultimately fail. But I think that bringing a resolution like that, making sure that it gets to the General Assembly, would further demonstrate that either the UN has to put up or shut up, get out of the way, or do something about it. And I think that if that resolution were to come to the floor, if it was voted down, if Russia vetoed it, it would demonstrate that the UN is truly a failed international organization, and that perhaps the democratic world and those that share our values should be working more closely together to protect those values, because clearly the UN is not capable of doing so. At that point, I think that Canada and NATO, we do have a responsibility to protect those refugees. And I think that under the responsibility to protect would justify NATO or a coalition of the willing to go in and protect those civilians, the refugees who are trying to flee, making sure that those corridors that Russia and Ukraine agree to create, that Russia keeps to its word. And if they try to attack those refugees, that there is a cost for them to do so.
You know, you and I have talked about the experience of history in the past. And I think that the Western world was incredibly embarrassed that we didn't know better and do more about the Holocaust during World War II. If there's truly 10,000 people that have died in Mariupol, and there's been these atrocities you mentioned in other cities, and there's going to be carnage, as you call it, even more. Don't we have an obligation as humans to do something?
Right, and let's look back at history just one more time. The 4.5 million Canadians of Central and Eastern European heritage, they've seen Russian liberation before. In 1941, the Soviets, or in 1939, in fact, the Soviets signed an agreement with Adolf Hitler to coordinate the start of the Second World War and the invasion of Poland. Those same Soviet forces, Hitler agreed to give Stalin the Baltic states. We saw what happened during that occupation: mass terror, deportations, murder, torture. The Nazis, of course, they believed that they liberated those countries from the Soviets. We saw a continuation of the brutality under the Nazis. The Soviets then, once again in 1944 and 1945, re-liberated those countries, much of Central and Eastern Europe, from the Nazis. We saw what that liberation looked like. That liberation looks very much like what we're seeing today in Ukraine, whether it's Bucha, the rape of women. This happened throughout the region, Central and Eastern Europe, in 1944 and onwards for nearly half a century. We know how the Russians behave, and what we're seeing in Ukraine today is not much unlike what we saw in 1944 and 1945. And we've been seeing this over and over again for the past decade with Russia's invasion of Georgia. We saw it in 2014. We saw the efforts by the Russians to destabilize US democracy in 2016 during the US presidential elections. We've seen this over and over again. We've failed to learn the lessons, and we failed to stand up to Vladimir Putin. We've done a much better job over the past 6 to 7 weeks of standing up to Vladimir Putin. But unless we hand him a complete defeat at this point, I'm afraid that we are going to see this sort of a cycle of crisis happen, of conflict happen over and over again, because let's not forget, Vladimir Putin changed the constitution of his country just last summer, allowing him to stay in power until at least 2035, if not longer.
How can we possibly defeat Putin? Maybe we could, and Ukraine could throw him out of Ukraine, probably only, frankly, out of the parts of Ukraine that he didn't annex and or absorb in 2014. But no one's talking about invading Ukraine. I mean, invading Russia. So how do you actually defeat Putin?
Well, first of all, we need to do, as we were talking about before, we need to help the Ukrainians defend themselves. That means sending them the equipment and the resources to allow them to do so. We saw how they were able to push the Russians back out of Kiev. The carnage that was exposed after that was heartbreaking, but they were able to do it. If we can supply them with the right tools, I believe that they can push back the Russians, perhaps not all the way out of Donbass, but at least to the positions that they were at before this war started. They might even have a fighting chance in the south to push the Russians out. If we can help the Ukrainians do that, that will be an embarrassing defeat for Vladimir Putin that he will feel domestically, because eventually the news of this defeat, the failures will get out in Russia.
Do you really believe that would stop Putin, though? Wouldn't he just keep on trying?
he will keep on trying. But if we combine those with the economic sanctions that we've placed on him today, Russia essentially defaulted on their loans. They promised to repay some of their investors back in rubles. Nobody wants that. And it was deemed to be in default of those loans. If we allow the sanctions to bite more, if we place more sanctions on them, if we work with the Europeans to wean them completely off Russian energy, if we ban all Russian exports in Canada, that will begin to hurt Putin. Not tomorrow, but it will in 6 months to 12 months. Combine that with a complete defeat in Ukraine. I think that could eventually, not tomorrow, it's not an immediate solution, but if we're looking in 2 to 3 years down the road, we will see a change in government in Russia.
The fatal flaw in what you've just described, I think, is Western Europe, Central Europe, weaning itself from Russian oil and gas. And that obviously has been so far impossible. How do you think that actually could occur?
Well, look, I think this is the allies working together with each other. I think it's a combination of Europe shifting towards nuclear energy. We know that the Germans have tried to move away from nuclear, but there is a solution there. Canada can help with that. Canada has the technology, nuclear technology, and these micro reactors or the small regional reactors that we specialize in. We can help provide that technology. Canada can also provide with natural gas. This is the biggest problem in Europe right now, is the complete over-reliance, the dangerous over-reliance on Russian gas. Canada has a lot of gas. We just don't have the terminals right now on our eastern seaboard that would allow us to transport it on from there. The pipelines exist. They need a bit of modernization. But if we can get that gas to the Atlantic coast, we can get it to Europe. The Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Estonians, the Poles have all said that they want to shift onto non-Russian liquefied natural gas. The Lithuanians already built an LNG terminal some 5-6 years ago. They're waiting. They've said this publicly, that they are waiting for Canadian gas. Even French President Emmanuel Macron said at NATO 2 weeks ago that he is hoping and relying on the US and Canada to help Europe wean itself off of Russian gas. So we have a significant role to play. We should be taking steps to get that gas to the Atlantic and not use excuses to obstruct it. This is a national security issue. The stability of our allies relies on it, and we can do a lot more. And also, I mean, it's not one side that's going to benefit from this. Our European allies will benefit from our gas and will benefit from it as well.
But so far, it doesn't appear we've been willing to take that action. And historical concerns about climate change and pipelines and carbon, et cetera, have restricted our ability to do exactly what you've described. So how are you going to get the political capital, the effort to change and get those pipelines shaping natural gas from Alberta all the way to the East Coast and then liquefying it and putting in LNG facilities?
Well, and it's these terminals, the liquefaction of those gas that's a real concern. Like I said, the pipelines already exist. There's been a lot of pushback in Quebec, but my understanding is that Enbridge has pipelines that will dip south through the United States and can come back up through New Brunswick and Nova Scotia. We just need those terminals built. And that's the real problem here. The political will, I mean, I think this has to all be reframed. I mean, we have to understand that this is a national security issue. It is in our interest to make sure that our NATO allies are not relying on Russian gas. Their over-reliance on Russian gas is a risk to us as well. A stable and safe Europe benefits us, because let's not forget, we're in NATO, and that border, whether it's the one between Estonia and Russia, Poland and Russia, Romania, I mean, all of these countries, that NATO border is our border as well. And it's our interest to make sure that it's secure. And energy plays a very, very big role in that, because let's be frank, Vladimir Putin has his hand on the taps. He's already threatened Europe that he's going to turn off the gas if they continue supporting Ukraine. And that's just a situation that we can't continue to just watch idly by and allow Vladimir Putin to have that sort of control. We can fix that with our gas, and we should be actively doing so.
Do you think that the federal government has the will to do what you're describing?
I'm not sure that they do at the moment.
What can you do to change their mind? What can we do to change their mind?
Well, I think it's a matter of public pressure, making them understand that it's in everyone's best interest to get that gas to Europe. It's a fuel that's being used widely in this transition to a greener world, and it's not going away anytime soon. So burying our heads in the sand, hoping that natural gas will go away and that everyone will start, in the next year or two driving around in electric vehicles, it's not going to happen, certainly not in Europe. We need to realize that there is this over-reliance on gas. Europe is not changing that quickly. And in the meantime, we have a role to play, a positive role to play. And in fact, I think the entire world, whether it's the environment or the security environment, where the entire world, especially Europe, amongst our allies and Canada, will benefit from it.
I got to tell you that I agree with you on this point almost more than almost anything else you've said. I think that, you go back to FDR during the land lease discussions, and he talked about you've got a fire hose and you've got your water and your neighbor's house is on fire. We've got the water. We've got that oil and gas, and we can supply it to, and as you say, make a profit out of it to all of our allies in Western and Central Europe, and save them from sending billions of dollars of profit to Putin day in and day out. And yet we don't have the wherewithal to put the hose down to ship that fuel to them and what they need. So I think that this has got to be something that we, as a population, as a government, as a country, have as one of our number one priorities, because maybe we don't have the tanks. Maybe we have let ourselves down over the course of the last couple of decades and don't have lots of war munitions ready to ship, but we've got oil and gas ready to ship. And if we can starve Putin of that oil and gas revenue, that's got to do more to close down this war than almost anything else, other than maybe air defense.
Right. Europe is spending $1 billion a day in Russian, and sending $1 billion a day to Russia to buy gas and oil. We can help shut that down, because that is what is funding his war right now, is Europe's over-reliance on gas. We can help, and we just need to commit to doing it. It won't cost a lot, but the end result is win-win for our European allies and for us.
We're chatting with Marcus Kolga tonight about Russia invasion of Ukraine. He's also a disinformation expert. And so after the break for some messages, I'm going to come back and ask him about Russian propaganda and disinformation and where that is and how we stop it. And are Russians getting the correct information? Stay with us, everybody. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour on Saga 960. I'm having a really interesting chat tonight with Marcus Kolga, who is an expert on what's going on in Eastern Europe. He works with the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. He's a filmmaker, which is kind of interesting. His parents come from Estonia, so he has a very personal connection to what's going on in Eastern Europe. And he's a disinformation expert. So, Marcus, we've been talking about the war. And one of the things that lots of people have talked about is the use of propaganda. And I think it's the use of media is actually an interesting topic, because I think that clearly the propaganda that Russia has been using is one issue that we need to talk about. And I'd like to hear your points of view on that. But one of the other things is the very powerful, positive media use by the president of Ukraine. And it's unbelievable. And I think there's no disinformation there. I think it is all accurate information. I'd like to know your point of view on that. And it's very powerful. It's authentic. And it seems to have captured the world's attention. So tell me a little bit, maybe to start with, about Russian propaganda. And do you think that Russians are actually getting true information anywhere, anyhow?
Great question. So there are two sides to this propaganda war when it comes to Russia. The propaganda and disinformation that is targeting those of us in the outside world. And there's, of course, the propaganda and disinformation that is targeting his own people. The narratives are very much similar. Vladimir Putin has tried to make his own people believe, and us believe, that Ukraine is being run by a drug-addled Nazi government, the same government that is run by its Jewish president, Volodymyr Zelensky. He has also denied over and over again that Russia is involved in any sort of war, that it is a special operation, that there are a limited number of troops that are in Ukraine that are there in efforts to de-Nazify it. And this is the disinformation that he's primarily trying to feed to his own people in Russia. And he's doing so quite successfully, simply for the fact that over the past 22 years that Vladimir Putin has been in power, he has been able to eliminate almost all independent media. During that time, he has been able to, he's assassinated a number of journalists, especially the ones that are critical of his regime. And through that process, he's intimidated other journalists, forcing them to flee abroad. Many of them are in Latvia and Lithuania, continuing to do their work. The problem is that those independent media and these independent journalists who are now abroad, their work isn't seen inside Russia, because in addition to eliminating all independent media, Vladimir Putin has managed to seal off his country, his people, his internet from the outside world by censoring a lot of these independent media outlets, including CNN, BBC. None of that information is penetrating through this iron wall, that the virtual iron curtain, as it were, that Vladimir Putin has erected around Russia. So because of that, Russian polling right now, if we're to believe these poll numbers, because everything is controlled by the state, these polling numbers suggest that a majority of Russians do support Vladimir Putin's invasion and the war right now. Any information to the outside world and to Russians, any suggestions that Russia is engaging in these war crimes, these atrocities that we've been seeing evidence of, firing missiles into civilian areas, into urban areas. All of this has been denied by the Kremlin. The Kremlin, both domestically and abroad, is suggesting that the Ukrainians are actually bombing themselves, that Ukraine itself is staging, along with NATO, these atrocities. The massacre that we saw in Bucha, where there were dozens upon dozens of bodies strewn across the streets with their hands tied behind the back, single bullet wounds to their heads. Clearly, these men had been executed. There's a suggestion that these were all actors. And unfortunately, because Putin controls media in Russia, this is the only he's created a complete alternate reality in his country. And, it doesn't matter how smart or not smart you are in Russia. The fact is, if this is the only reality that you are being fed, and that you have there are no other facts, no independent media that Russians have access to, a lot of Russians are unfortunately believing this propaganda. The other important fact that impacts Canada is that this same Russian language propaganda, this disinformation, is also being fed to the hundreds of thousands of Russian speakers that live here in Canada. And there's a real threat that if we continue allowing Russian state media to bombard Canadian Russians, and the small, a relatively small minority that exclusively get their news from Russian state media, there's a threat that these Russians could be radicalized. And we've seen a rising incidence of anti-Ukrainian hate crimes, graffiti throughout Canada. There's a recent report of a Ukrainian church being defaced with the letter Z. This is the symbol of the Russian invasion, a nationalist symbol that has emerged over the past few weeks. The church was defaced with these symbols. There's also been a number of cases in Toronto. There's a bakery, Future Bakery, which is owned by a prominent Ukrainian family. bakery has been vandalized at least 6 times over the past 7 to 8 weeks. And so this is a serious problem. And the Canadian government, the CRTC, has done a good job of removing the license of RT, which is the English language state broadcaster, but it needs to do more and remove Russian language state broadcasters from Canada's public airwaves as well.
I saw a really disturbing report that suggested that a lot of people that were anti-vaxxers caught up in the QAnon theory, conspiracy theories, were also believing that this Russian invasion of Ukraine is a hoax. And that it appears that these same echo chambers that were creating anti-vaxxers, pro-Trump, Trump won the election, and QAnon theories were also against, against Ukraine, against the reality of what's going on in Ukraine today. Does that make any sense?
Well, it wouldn't make sense for someone who isn't familiar with disinformation. It wouldn't make any sense at all because the two seem completely disconnected. They're not, however. The research that I've been doing over the past 2 years, starting at the beginning of the pandemic, we saw immediately in March 2020, at the start of the pandemic, Russian state media, actors aligned with it in the information space, latching on to COVID, especially the anti-lockdown narratives and the anti-vaccination narratives later on in late 2020. And a lot of these were being promoted, like I said, by Russian state media. Even the Russian embassy itself here in Canada was promoting vaccine hesitancy towards Western vaccines very early on. And those narratives got picked up by a small minority of people who were protesting against the lockdowns, organizations that were arranging protests right here in Toronto and elsewhere in Canada. They were taking that information and promoting it through their social media channels. And so what we saw over the course of the pandemic was these anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination movements and narratives transform more into anti-government narratives. And we saw during the recent Ottawa trucker protests that were ostensibly about, they were anti-lockdown, anti-vaccination protests. We saw Russian state media, RT in fact, send a reporter to Ottawa who was on the ground reporting, it seemed every half hour, directly to RT studios in Moscow. They found fringe voices within the protests who they brought on, who were advocating for police to join the protesters and to engage in the violent overthrow of our democratically elected government, to essentially storm parliament. So Russian state media was providing a platform for these voices and effectively legitimizing what were absolutely a minority of voices, but legitimizing them using their platform, again, piggybacking on anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination narratives. So these platforms were directly attacked. These Russian state media platforms were directly attacking our democracy. And what was interesting, 7 weeks ago, at the start of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, I was keeping an eye on some of these local anti-vaccination, anti-lockdown groups on Twitter. And it was curious how their narratives shifted literally overnight. On February 24th, when the invasion began, they shifted from COVID-related narratives, anti-vaccination narratives, to ones that were echoing Russian narratives about Ukraine, the denazification of Ukraine, its Nazi government, and how our prime minister, who they also claim is some form of Nazi, how he was working together, he was going to support the Nazi president of Ukraine. And this has continued since the start of the invasion, this promoting of Russian narratives. So while the two may seem to be disconnected, the anti-lockdown and anti-vaccination movements from Russia, they are in fact very similar and share a lot of the same ideas and values, apparently.
I don't understand how they share similar ideas and values. They seem very different, but it appears to me that there's a group of society that are sort of stuck in these echo chambers controlled by whoever, Russian state TV or something. And I have an associate, a friend who, he comments on my Facebook frequently. He was a questioner of the Trump election. He supported the big lie. He was very anti-vax, and then recently he's become very pro-Russian and and not believing any of the stories coming out of Ukraine. And I just don't understand how the values are the same. It's just that it's as if he's been captured by disinformation.
Yeah, I don't think the people who believe in the conspiracy theories don't necessarily share values with Vladimir Putin, but it is those organizers, the people behind the disinformation, those that are willing to promote that disinformation, that Russian disinformation, where they do share similar values. They are, as we saw on RT, they are happy to promote the fringes of that group, and they are often the organizers of these larger protests. They are anti-democracy. They are anti-government. And they don't respect our democracy. And so, unfortunately, there are those individuals who are baited by these sorts of narratives, and they believe them because they mix up these other narratives, like the anti-lockdown narratives, like the anti-vaccination narratives, with other ones. And so it becomes this toxic mixture of various different false narratives, disinformation, and such that's fed to them. And once an individual is susceptible to a few of them, and they open their minds and take down the cognitive barriers to accepting certain narratives, then it's much easier to feed them other ones. And it becomes this really toxic cycle that continues on and on. And I'm not sure how we're going to fix that.
What can we do? Is there anything we can do?
Well, I have friends as well who I just had a debate, if you want to call it that, on Facebook with one of them today, and against my better judgment. Usually I don't engage in those sorts of debates publicly. It's hard to understand how we can bring a lot of these people back to reality, essentially. Often when people ask me this, what can we do? I mean, it's very hard to convince someone who believes the earth is flat that it's not, because these people often just believe in an alternate set of facts. And if they believe in these alternate facts that are not based in any sort of truth, it's very hard to debate with them. So, and the same could be said about a lot of these anti-vax movements, individuals who are against the lockdowns. They also believe in an alternate set of facts, and they're being fed this stream of facts, whether it's through Russian state media or their proxy platforms. So bringing these people back to reality, I think it's going to be a challenge, but one that I think our entire society, including our government, needs to think about and address.
It's scary, there's no question, because some of these people really are caught up in this alternative reality, and it's broken apart friendships and relationships and families, and some people are just completely captivated by these conspiracy theories. Anyway, we're going to take a final break, and come back in 2 minutes with Marcus Kolga. And I'm going to ask him about what next, because he's expressed some concerns about what could happen if we don't stop Putin. And I want to ask him about that after a break. Stay with us, everybody. We're back with Marcus Kolga, senior gentleman at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, a filmmaker, an expert on Eastern Europe, someone that has been very closely following what's going on in the Russian invasion of Ukraine. And as you found out in the last segment, a disinformation expert, which is kind of interesting. Marcus, you told me once that if we don't stop Putin now, the next step's going to be the Baltics or Romania or Moldova. Where are you now? What do you think?
Well, I mean, if anything is possible, we can't rule anything out from Vladimir Putin. I mean, he's demonstrated in Ukraine that he is capable of the most heinous crimes, things that we didn't believe would happen again after the Second World War. So like I said, anything is possible. I think that what we need to do, certainly with regards to NATO and our Eastern partners, and our own Arctic for that matter, is to raise the cost of Vladimir Putin doing the same sort of thing that he's doing in Ukraine in anywhere else. That means ensuring that we arm with our own troops and our own and weapons and such. We arm the Baltic states and Poland and other Eastern allies to the teeth, making sure that there are permanent missions in all the Baltic states and Poland, not just these reassurance missions, which we have to keep renewing over and over again. We need to give them the assurance that NATO is there permanently, and that NATO will defend those countries should Vladimir Putin try anything in the future. And we know that he's kept an eye. He's tried in Estonia back in 2007. He tried to destabilize the country and engaged in the first ever cyber attacks, state-sponsored cyber attacks against a foreign country. Canada should also be very much aware of the threat that Vladimir Putin poses to Canada in the Arctic.
Our Arctic, Putin, you really think so?
Well, again, we can't rule anything out. We know that Vladimir Putin has engaged in a rapid militarization of the Russian Arctic region for the past 10 years. He's built or refurbished 26 bases, most of them with offensive capabilities, long-range bomber bases. He's built new Arctic super weapons. There is a high-speed underwater nuclear torpedo, a stealth torpedo, in fact, that is designed to run underneath the Arctic ice and irradiate Arctic coastlines. This is not a defensive weapon. This is clearly an offensive weapon. And last spring, Vladimir Putin's government laid claim to all of the resources underneath the Arctic Sea. And in its Arctic strategy, which was adopted into law last year, it basically stated that Russia would engage in long-term resource imperialism. This means ensuring and expanding its resources to include much of the Arctic, and it warned about a coming Arctic conflict. I don't think that any NATO nation is preparing itself to engage in any sort of Arctic conflict. Canada is not gearing up to attack our Arctic neighbors. I don't think that the Swedes or the Finns or the Norwegians are doing this. It's only one country that is mobilizing itself and getting itself seemingly prepared for some sort of conflict, and that's Russia. And I think Canadians need to remember that Russia's most northern Air Force base, one that is intended to house long-range nuclear bombers, is as far away from Canada's coastline as Ottawa is from Winnipeg. That's not a long distance. For a hypersonic jet, it could arrive and be over Canada's coastlines within 15 minutes or so, 20 minutes. So the threat is real. I would have said, maybe 7-8 weeks ago that perhaps there shouldn't be an immediate concern. Maybe Russia is preparing to defend itself, but after the invasion of Ukraine, again, I say that we can't rule out anything. And all indications point to Russia certainly, engaging in resource imperialism in the Arctic, laying claim to much of it and taking much of it for itself. The weapons that Putin has placed or produced in the Arctic will help him do that. And I think we need to be prepared for Vladimir Putin to challenge our own sovereignty in the Arctic and that of our allies.
Marcus Kolga, thank you so much for joining us today and bringing us up to speed on what's going on and giving us a lot to think about in regards to disinformation and friends of ours that have been sucked into these vortexes of disinformation. What Canada needs to do from a military standpoint in supporting both the Baltic states and other NATO allies, as well as armaments to the Ukraine. I thought your comparison of what Estonia has given, I think you said 250 million versus Canada 40 million, is shocking, and that's something that all of us should be concerned and embarrassed about. And then most importantly, I think, is your comment that if we don't do something dramatically more than we currently are, that there's going to be an incredible travesty of a loss of human life in eastern Ukraine, because it looks like, as I think you probably strongly believe, that Putin is going to be attacking all over again with, what'd you call this general?
He's known as the Butcher of Aleppo.
The Butcher of Aleppo. That's not the kind of guy that. Anyway, thank you. Appreciate it. Not a pleasant conversation, but a conversation we all got to have. That's our show for tonight, everyone. Thank you for joining us. I'm on every Monday through Friday at 6 o'clock on 960 AM. You can stream me online at www.saga960am.ca. You can get all my podcasts and videocasts on briancrombie.com. The videos are on Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and YouTube, and the podcasts are on Apple, Audible, Speakeasy, and SoundCloud. Thanks for joining us, everybody. Thank you, Marcus. Good night.
Thanks, Brian.